Buried in the old records of Dakota Prairie is a file sealed for over 40 years, the case of Henrik Olsen and the 23 people who vanished in what locals still call the Devil's March. On Valentine's Day in 1889, 24 souls left Fort Buford headed west toward new settlements near what is now Williston. 3 days later, only one man returned half-frozen, raving, and carrying a leather pouch filled with gold coins that weren't his. His tale of wolves, blizzards, and desperate heroism satisfied the authorities for just 6 weeks until a trapper named Ezra Kowalski stumbled on something in a canyon that made officials question everything they thought they knew about survival loyalty and what a man will do for greed. What Kowalski uncovered didn't just explain the fate of the missing pioneers. It revealed a cruelty so cold-blooded it stunned even the toughest lawmen of the Dakota Territory. Back then, the air was charged with the promise of statehood and the lure of free land through the Homestead Act. Fort Buford stood like a last line of civilization along the Missouri River, where families stocked up, hired guides, and braced themselves before crossing into country where the nearest neighbor could be 50 miles away, and a single storm could bury a home under 12 feet of snow. At the center of it all was Henrik Olsen, a Norwegian immigrant who had survived 5 brutal winters and earned a reputation as one of the most reliable guides in the territory. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and spoke English with only a trace of an accent, reading the sky and stars as if nature itself whispered its secrets to him. Families trusted him because no one he led had ever been lost to the elements. That trust was his greatest weapon. Among those who followed him that February were Thomas and Ellelanina Bergstrom, with their 3 daughters, and Ellelanina's aging mother Martha, who swore she'd rather die on free land than in an eastern city. The Kowalski brothers Jan Pota and Stanislaw spent their railroad savings chasing dreams of cattle and wheat. Young Dr. Samuel Hartwell brought his pregnant wife Rebecca and their twin boys, hoping to open the territory's first real hospital. Then there was Patrick Brennan, a former Union officer who believed the isolation of the plains might heal his eldest son Michael, haunted by night terrors since fighting the Lakota. His wife Catherine, no stranger to uprooting her family, carefully packed what little they had left for yet another chance at a fresh start. Henrik studied them all with the sharp eye of a man who measured more than supplies and wagons. He measured desperation. He offered fair prices, $50 a family payable on safe arrival. What none of them knew was that during the previous autumn, Henrik had scouted the land not for homesteads, but for something far darker. The morning of February 14th dawned clear and bitterly cold, the air hovering around 0. For mid-February, on the Dakota plains, it was practically mild, and Henrik assured the families this would make travel easier. Before sunrise, the 6 families gathered with their wagons creaking under the weight of seed grain tools, medical kits, and the few precious belongings they had managed to keep after the ruthless culling required for life on the frontier. Henrik packed his gear with the practiced ease of a seasoned guide, canvas tarps, lantern oil coils of rope, and a set of tools for wagon repairs. What no one noticed was the spade tucked beneath the canvas, the surplus blankets, and a map marked with places that had nothing to do with homesteads. As they rolled west along the frozen Missouri, Henrik's steady voice and easy stories about settlers who had carved out good lives on the prairie gave the families hope. Even Martha Lindfist, who had bitterly mourned leaving her church back in Minnesota, found herself talking about the garden she would plant come spring. No one questioned the way Henrik checked his compass more than he should, or the fact that their route veered just slightly from the established markers. By the second day, when the trail should have swung south toward the Williston settlements, Henrik announced that he knew of a shortcut that would save 2 days of travel. It sounded sensible. Supplies were still strong, the weather stable, and everyone longed to arrive before the next storm. They followed his lead straight into the most desolate stretch of the Little Missouri Badlands, a maze of ravines and rocky outcrops where the world could swallow whole parties without a trace. On the third day, the storm came with the sudden fury only Dakota blizzards can muster. One moment the wagons moved beneath a heavy gray sky. The next, they were blind in a wall of snow, with the wind cutting like knives and the temperature plunging to 20 below. Henrik called for the wagons to circle the standard procedure, but instead of sheltering in the center, he led them into what he promised was a natural windbreak. It was a box canyon. The storm roared down its narrow walls, trapping the families in a funnel of snow and cold. When Thomas Bergstrom suggested they retreat to the open prairie and wait it out on higher ground, Henrik shook his head and shouted over the wind that moving now would mean certain death. "By morning it will pass," he told them. "Just keep the children warm." But morning came and the storm only grew worse. For 2 days and nights, the families clung to each other inside wagons that could not keep out the wind. Food dwindled. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. On the second night, Michael Brennan, haunted already by war, began to notice what others did not. While families shared scraps and blankets, Henrik seemed untouched by the hardship. He always had dry firewood when everything else was soaked. He always had extra food when others went hungry. And when he stepped away into the storm, he moved through the canyon like a man who already knew every rock and path. Michael whispered his suspicions to his father, but Patrick, exhausted, dismissed it at first as another sign of his son's troubled mind. By the third day, though, Patrick saw it too. The guide's endless supply of wood, the way his pack never seemed to empty, the way he bristled with sudden anger when Thomas suggested sending scouts to find shelter. "No one leaves the group." Henrik snapped his calm mask, slipping to reveal something hard beneath. "In weather like this, leaving means death. I've seen it too many times." When Dr. Hartwell offered to join a scouting party, insisting that his duty to his pregnant wife and the other vulnerable travelers demanded it, Henrik shut him down with unsettling firmness. "Doctor, you're needed here," he said. "I'm the only one who knows these badlands well enough to move safely. Trust me, I've guided families through worse." His calm words might have reassured most, but there was a problem. Henrik had told them this route was meant to avoid the Badlands entirely. That contradiction lingered in the minds of those still thinking clearly through the haze of cold and hunger. On the fourth morning, Henrik made the announcement that sealed the group's fate. He claimed he had seen smoke in the distance, maybe another wagon party, maybe a trapper's cabin. He would scout ahead alone, he promised, and return within 6 hours with help. "Keep the fires burning and stay near the wagons. If I'm not back by sunset, send up 3 smoke signals and I'll find you." With that, he rode off on his horse, carrying only a light pack and his rifle. What he didn't share was that he wasn't riding toward rescue at all, but toward a hidden cache of supplies he had stashed the autumn before. Food blankets, fuel enough to keep him comfortable while nature finished off the families he had led into the canyon. They never saw him again. By sunset of the 4th day, the survivors were ripping wagon wheels from their frames to burn for warmth, desperate to keep the children alive. By the 5th morning, they faced an impossible choice remain, and pray Henrik would return or strike out on foot through chest-deep snow and certain exhaustion. Martha Lindfist, 72 years old and unflinchingly honest, finally spoke the words the others were too afraid to say. "He's not coming back. Something's happened, or worse." She didn't finish, but no one needed her to. They chose to wait one more day. On February 19th, Henrik Olsen staggered through the gates of Fort Buford. Frostbitten, delirious, and barely able to speak, he collapsed before the commanding officer and gasped out words that would haunt the territory for decades. "They're all gone. The wolves. Dear God, the wolves." When he recovered enough to tell his story, Henrik cast himself as the lone survivor of a nightmare. The blizzard, he swore, had been the worst he had ever endured in 5 years as a guide. The cold had broken the family's strength, and just as hope failed, a pack of wolves had descended, finishing what the storm began. His testimony painted him as the tragic hero who had fought valiantly to save 23 souls, only to return alone, broken and grieving. "I tried to fight them off." Henrik sobbed to Territorial Marshal James McReynolds, holding out his frost-bitten hands, the torn skin and raw wounds lending weight to his story. There were too many, and the families were too weak to run. The Bergstrom girls, dear Christ, the sound they made. His account was rich with detail. The storm's relentless escalation, the spot where they had sheltered, and the supposed acts of heroism that gave his tale the ring of truth. He described Dr. Hartwell's final moments, tending to the wounded, even as wolves circled closer, and Thomas Bergstrom's desperate last stand, wielding a broken wagon wheel as a shield to protect his daughters. It was a story of courage in the face of horror, and to men hardened by the Dakota Territory's cruelty, it was not only believable, but expected. Marshal McReynolds, a veteran of Indian campaigns and prairie winters, found nothing in Henrik's words that clashed with his own understanding of how fast death could sweep over a party of settlers. More than that, Henrik carried proof. The leather pouch clutched in his hands contained exactly the sum the families would have pooled together, savings meant for supplies and land filings. Henrik explained he had gathered the money from their bodies, hoping to return it to relatives back east before scavengers could profit from the dead. "It seemed the least I could do," he told the marshal. "Thomas Bergstrom made me promise with his dying breath that I'd see his family's savings sent to Milwaukee. The others asked the same of me. I had to honor their wishes." Within days, authorities organized a recovery expedition, though late February thaw made the search dangerous and limited. After a week in the field, the party returned with little more than scraps of clothing. Broken wagon parts and churned snow that might have been a kill site. No bodies were ever found. Marshal McReynolds explained the absence in words the frontier understood well. Wolves leave nothing behind, not in a hard winter. The explanation satisfied officials. Henrik Olsen was cleared of suspicion, praised as a survivor, and lauded for trying to preserve the legacy of the dead. He even used the family's savings to purchase land, announcing plans to build a homestead that would stand as a memorial to those who had perished. For 6 weeks, his story held strong. He settled onto his property, spoke of planting in the spring, and even granted interviews to the territorial paper about creating a guide service focused on safety so no other families would meet such a fate. Neighbors called him a living example of frontier resilience, a man who turned grief into purpose. Then came Ezra Kowalski's discovery. Kowalski, a Polish trapper, hardened by 3 years of surviving the Little Missouri's ravines and bluffs, knew the wilderness as well as any man alive. Unlike farmers and townsfolk who accepted Henrik's tale at face value, Kowalski understood wolves, and more importantly, he understood the ways of desperate men in the Dakota Badlands. More importantly, Ezra Kowalski had been in the region during the February storm, and he knew the weather hadn't behaved the way Henrik described. While following his trap lines through a canyon nearly 40 miles from the supposed tragedy site, Kowalski stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Beneath a rock overhang shielded from the worst of the wind lay an established camp. not the makeshift refuge of desperate pioneers, but a carefully prepared base stocked long before the storm. Firewood had been cut and stacked in neat rows. Canvas shelters were arranged for long-term use. And most damning of all, a cache of food far greater than any guide would reasonably carry just in case. This was no emergency shelter. This was a hideout. Among the supplies, Kowalski found items that shattered Henrik Olsen's story. A child's mitten stitched with the initials AB. A woman's hairpin of the kind Swedish immigrants favored. A pocket watch etched with the initials TB, Thomas Bergstrom's watch. When Kowalski carried these discoveries to Marshal McReynolds, the territorial authorities faced a chilling possibility. The heroic survivor was not a victim at all, but the architect of a crime unlike anything they had ever seen on the frontier. The investigation that followed revealed cracks in Henrik's tale that widened with every piece of evidence. McReynolds, joined by Judge William Hartfield, and a small party of deputies, inspected the hidden camp. What they found directly contradicted Henrik's account. He claimed the storm had trapped them for 4 days before wolves struck. Yet the camp's supplies showed planning for weeks of survival with work that could never have been done during a raging blizzard. Even more telling was the location. Henrik had led his party into a box canyon that offered little protection, a baffling choice for a man known for his skill in reading the land. Meanwhile, the hidden camp sat in what any competent guide would have recognized as ideal shelter. The implication was clear. Henrik hadn't chosen poorly. He had chosen deliberately. Judge Hartfield ordered a deeper search, and what his men uncovered only grew darker. Between the box canyon and the hidden camp, they traced boot prints preserved in packed snow that matched the heavy boots Henrik favored. The tracks showed one man making multiple trips over several days. At the so-called wolf attack site, the evidence told a different story than Henrik's tearful testimony. Wagon parts weren't shattered in desperation. They had been dismantled in an orderly fashion. Personal belongings weren't scattered by chaos. They had been sifted through, carefully examined, and discarded. And hidden under a pile of rocks, the investigators found what Henrik had tried hardest to conceal: valuables. Jewelry, cash documents. Items proving that the families he claimed were penniless dreamers had carried far more wealth than anyone realized. Rebecca Hartwell had carried her grandmother's silver locket valued at $50 a fortune on the Prairie. Yet Henrik had somehow overlooked it when collecting the victim's belongings. The Kowalski brothers had pooled more than $300 from years of railroad wages into a heavy money belt, far more than the sum Henrik turned over to authorities. And Thomas Bergstrom wasn't just carrying family savings. He had inherited a cache of gold coins from his father's shipping business. Piece by piece, the evidence suggested a brutal truth. Henrik Olsen had stripped the families of their wealth and left them to die. But theft alone did not prove murder. To convict Henrik, investigators needed to explain how 23 people had perished while their guide emerged almost unscathed. Marshal McReynolds called upon Dr. Charles Whitman, the territorial physician who had examined Henrik upon his return to Fort Buford. Initially, Dr. Whitman's report supported Henrik's tale of survival. The guide showed signs of frostbite and exposure. Yet when asked to reevaluate his findings, Whitman admitted something troubling. Henrik's frostbite was mild, the kind of injury one might suffer after hours in the cold, not days. He was tired and hungry, yes, but not the shattered wreck of a man who had endured 4 days in the teeth of a Dakota blizzard. The case turned when deputies searched Henrik's homestead. In the root cellar, buried beneath sacks of seed grain, they unearthed relics of the dead. children's clothing still carrying the faint perfume Elena Bergstrom used on Sundays. Dr. Hartwell's medical bag filled with instruments no guide could have afforded. Catherine Brennan's wedding ring, a distinctive Irish design her husband had described in grief-stricken detail. But the most damning find was a leather-bound journal. Its pages revealed not desperation, but calculation. All through the autumn of 1888, Henrik had scouted remote canyons, searching for places where a party could vanish without trace. He cached food, firewood, and tools in secret hideouts, ensuring his own comfort, while others froze and starved. And he profiled his victims. The December 15th entry read, "The Bergstrom family inquired today about spring passage to homestead sites near the Yellowstone. They carry substantial savings and travel with elderly mother who would slow any rescue attempts. Perfect candidates for western route through canyon system. Must ensure no other guides are available during their desired travel period." The journal documented how Henrik undercut competitors, nurtured a spotless reputation, and tracked weather systems that would give him cover for mass killing. The final entry, dated February 10th, 1889, just 4 days before departure, exposed the cold heart behind the mask of heroism. Weather reports indicate severe storm system approaching from northwest. Families are eager to depart before conditions worsen. Will suggest early departure and direct route through Badlands. With proper preparation, should be able to eliminate all witnesses while maintaining appearance of natural disaster. Must remember to return reasonable portion of victim's money to avoid suspicion. The evidence against Henrik Olsen was staggering. Yet Marshal McReynolds faced the dilemma that haunted frontier courts for decades. How do you prove murder without bodies when the accused insists on his innocence and spins tales to fit each accusation? When confronted with the journal and the stolen property, Henrik shifted his role from heroic survivor to wrongly accused victim. He claimed the journal was a forgery planted by Ezra Kowalski, the trapper who, in Henrik's words, had long resented his success and wanted the reward money offered for information on the missing families. "That Pole has been watching my homestead for weeks," Henrik told Judge Hartfield. "He knows I've prospered where others failed. He's been planning this since the day I came back." His explanation for the hidden cache of supplies was just as slippery. He insisted the stores were meant to sustain a spring expedition to bury the victims properly once the weather eased. The valuables found in his root cellar, he claimed, were simply being kept in trust until he could locate relatives back east. "I wanted to tell them their loved ones had received a Christian burial," he said, "not that I had failed them to wolves. It was just plausible enough to create doubt, especially in a court system more familiar with horse theft and barroom brawls than a case of 23 vanished souls." Judge Hartfield knew the entire territory believed Henrik guilty, but legal proof was elusive. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Michael Brennan. The war-haunted young man, whose nerves made others doubt his testimony, turned out to be the one person too troubled to let Henrik's story rest. Michael retraced the party's route, spoke to travelers, and pieced together a puzzle that led him to the testimony of Sarah Kowalski, Ezra's wife. Sarah had been checking trap lines on February 16th, the very day Henrik swore he was locked in a desperate battle with wolves. From a ridge, she saw a lone man in the canyon below, methodically loading belongings onto a travois and covering his tracks. He wasn't moving like someone who had survived tragedy, she later testified. He moved like a man who had all the time in the world. Her description of the rider and his horse matched Henrik exactly. That single detail shattered his timeline. He could not have been both with the families fighting wolves and alone at a hidden camp miles away. Even then, conviction might have wavered, if not for what deputies uncovered during a final search near the camp. A shallow grave disturbed by scavengers revealed the small bodies of children. They had not been mauled by wolves, nor struck down in a single storm. Dr. Whitman's examination showed they had died slowly, from hunger and exposure days after Henrik claimed all had perished. Even worse traces of food and signs of minimal warmth suggested the children had been kept alive, just enough to linger, not enough to live. They had been preserved as insurance hostages to fate in case searchers arrived too soon. The revelation transformed the case from robbery and neglect into deliberate, calculated murder. The settlers hadn't simply been abandoned, they had been methodically destroyed by a man who smiled at their children while plotting their deaths. On May 15, 1889, the trial of Henrik Olsen opened in the territorial courthouse at Bismarck. What might have been a swift case of frontier justice swelled into a legal spectacle, drawing crowds from across Dakota and reporters from as far as St. Paul. Eastern newspapers seized on the spectacle, dubbing it the Prairie Wolf Murder Trial. While local citizens packed the courthouse shoulder to shoulder, some traveling hundreds of miles just to see justice play out. Every morning, Henrik Olsen strode into the courtroom, dressed with the same immaculate precision that had once earned him the trust of 23 souls. His posture was straight, his face calm, his confidence unbroken. To the casual observer, he might have been a respectable farmer or town official. Rather than a man accused of orchestrating mass murder, Prosecutor James Mitchell dismantled that facade piece by piece. With a steady, deliberate cadence, he led the jury from Henrik's sterling reputation as a guide to the chilling evidence that revealed him as a predator who lured families into a trap. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mitchell declared in his opening statement, "we will show you that this man did not survive a tragedy. He created one. We will prove he spent months preparing for the systematic destruction of innocent families, led them knowingly into danger, and watched them die while he stayed warm and well-fed, counting their money and planning his escape." The prosecution's case grew more devastating with each witness. Dr. Whitman delivered the most harrowing testimony, describing in clinical yet gut-wrenching detail how the children's bodies bore the marks of slow death from cold and starvation. These children survived for at least a week after the supposed wolf attack, Whitman testified. They died slowly, while someone nearby possessed more than enough supplies to save them. Several jurors wept openly as he spoke. Then came Sarah Kowalski, whose quiet, plain-spoken account of seeing Henrik at the hidden camp, systematically looting, moving carefully, never like a man desperate or hunted, stripped away the last pretense of his innocence. She placed him exactly where he claimed he had never been on the very day he swore he was fighting for his life, alongside the doomed families. Finally, it was Michael Brennan who delivered the most searing blow. The young veteran, dismissed by many as unstable, spoke with a steady voice as he recounted Henrik's every movement in the canyon. "He knew exactly where to go," Michael said. Eyes locked on the jurors. Even in the storm, he moved like he'd been there before. And when people talked about leaving, about finding better shelter, he always had a reason to keep us there. Always a reason why only he could decide. His testimony transformed Henrik's scouting mission into what it truly was, the moment he abandoned them to die while retreating to safety. The defense, led by attorney Robert Carlyle, faced an impossible task. The evidence was crushing. The testimony was relentless. And the man they defended no longer appeared as a tragic survivor, but as the architect of a carefully engineered massacre. Carlyle's defense strategy leaned heavily on doubt. He painted Henrik not as a murderer, but as a survivor, made into a scapegoat by jealous rivals. My client is guilty of nothing more than living through a tragedy no one else could endure, Carlyle told the jury. And now he carries the burden of survival. That is not a crime, it is a punishment in itself. He accused Ezra Kowalski of orchestrating a frame-up, claiming the trapper planted evidence to ruin a successful immigrant guide. The journal could have been forged, Carlyle argued, and anyone with access to Henrik's homestead might have hidden the stolen goods in his cellar. The defense's most powerful moment came when Henrik himself took the stand. His voice trembled as he told the jury about the cries of children he could not save, the families who froze before his eyes, and the agony of gathering their valuables, not out of greed, but to keep them from vanishing into the snow. Tears streaked his face as he whispered, "I failed them. I was their guide, their protector, and I failed them. But I am not a killer. I am a broken man who must live every day with their ghosts." For a brief moment, the courtroom seemed to sway in his favor. But prosecutor James Mitchell's cross-examination stripped Henrik bare. Calmly, methodically, he forced Henrik to confront the contradictions in his story. Mr. Olsen, Mitchell asked, holding the jury's gaze as much as Henrik's, "If you were trapped with those families for 4 days, how do you explain Mrs. Kowalski's testimony? That she saw you at the hidden camp that same week, moving supplies with all the time in the world?" Henrik stammered that she must have been mistaken about the date, or that she had seen another man. The answer rang hollow in the silent courtroom. Then Mitchell delivered the final blow, a letter found hidden in Henrik's cabin, written but never sent. Dated March 1st, 1889, it was addressed to a contact in Minneapolis and discussed plans to expand his operations into Montana. In it, Henrik coldly described the February tragedy, not as catastrophe, but as proof of concept. "I have perfected techniques for managing large groups in isolated areas," the letter read. "The key is maintaining their trust, while systematically eliminating any possibility of escape or rescue." The February operation yielded substantial profits with minimal risk exposure. When Mitchell finished reading, the room was deathly still. Whatever sympathy Henrik had stirred evaporated in an instant. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before returning their verdict, guilty on all 23 counts of premeditated murder. Judge Hartfield, his voice heavy with disgust, pronounced the sentence. "You betrayed the trust of families who saw in you their hope for a better life," he declared. "Your crimes are an affront to every principle upon which civilized society depends." Judge Hartfield's voice carried through the silent courtroom as he pronounced the sentence. "You planned their deaths with the cold calculation of a merchant balancing his accounts. You watched children die while you remained comfortable and well-fed, counting their parents' money. For these crimes, there can be only one punishment. On September 12, 1889, at the Territorial Prison in Bismarck, Henrik Olsen was hanged. Witnesses reported that he met his fate without confession, insisting to the very end that he was the victim of jealous rivals and vengeful immigrants who resented his success. The case left its mark far beyond the gallows. For the first time, a territorial court had proven it could prosecute complex, premeditated murder without bodies to bury. It forced the government to recognize how vulnerable frontier families were to predators who wore the mask of respectability. New regulations required guides to register with local authorities, provide references, and submit to periodic inspections. Marshals were given broader powers to investigate suspicious disappearances, and rewards were posted to encourage reporting abuses. Families too changed their ways. Never again would a reputation alone be enough. Settlers began traveling in larger groups, hiring multiple guides, and arranging communication schedules with officials to ensure that missing parties were searched for quickly. The homesteads the 6 families had dreamed of were eventually claimed by others, but none prospered. Some said the land was cursed, More practical voices observed that the spots Henrik had chosen were poorly suited for farming and dangerously isolated from trade and medical help. Still, the superstition lingered. The belongings Henrik had hoarded were slowly returned to grieving relatives back east. Thomas Bergstrom's brother used the recovered savings to create a scholarship for children orphaned by frontier tragedies. Dr. Hartwell's medical instruments found their way to the Territorial Hospital, where they served Dakota families for years. Michael Brennan, the war-haunted young man whose suspicions had cracked Henrik's mask, carried survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. Yet he turned it into purpose, becoming a territorial marshal known for investigating missing persons with relentless care. His detailed reports on the Olsen case became required reading for lawmen across the Dakotas. As for Ezra Kowalski, the trapper, whose discovery unraveled the entire lie, he refused every reward. He returned to his trap lines along the Little Missouri. But those who knew him said he was never quite the same. Sarah Kowalski later confessed that her husband often woke in the night trembling, convinced he could hear children crying on the wind. The canyon where Henrik cached his supplies became a place of uneasy legend. Trappers and hunters swore that if you camped there, you could sometimes hear the faint sound of children laughing in the distance. Skeptics chalked it up to wind through stone, the eerie acoustics of the Badlands. But those who heard it knew better. The Devil's March had left its mark, and the echoes of betrayal carried long after the hangman's rope snapped taut in Bismarck. Even after Henrik Olsen swung from the gallows, his shadow stretched across the Dakotas. Over the next decade, reports surfaced of other hidden caches, tucked deep in the Badlands and along remote trails, 6 in total, each stocked with firewood canvas and food. None held direct evidence of killings, yet their very existence suggested that Olsen may not have been alone in seeing profit in the desperation of settlers. The case files remained sealed for decades until 1923, when historian Dr. Margaret Lindholm gained access while researching frontier crime for her dissertation. What she uncovered stunned even those familiar with Olsen's story. According to her analysis, Henrik had been refining his methods long before the February 1889 massacre. At least 3 years earlier, smaller parties had vanished under mysterious circumstances, disappearances that in light of her findings bore his mark. He exploited the very qualities that made frontier life possible. Dr. Lindholm later wrote in her 1925 book, Wolves Among Sheep, Crime and Justice in Territorial America. Trust, cooperation, and the willingness to rely on strangers for survival. These were his weapons. Financial records seized from Olsen's homestead told their own story. In just 3 years, he had amassed wealth equal to what a successful merchant might earn in 10. He funneled this fortune into properties purchased under false names, laying the groundwork for expansion far beyond Dakota. The most disturbing revelation came years later in 1902, when renovations on his abandoned cabin revealed a map hidden in the wall. It charted not only the sites of his known caches, but also immigrant trails winding through Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. Notes scrawled in the margins detailed seasonal weather patterns, travel times, and natural choke points, locations that could have been used as killing grounds. The map hinted at a campaign of murder on a scale far greater than the Devil's March. Had he not been exposed by Ezra Kowalski's discovery, Henrik Olsen might have seeded death across half the frontier, leaving scattered families to vanish without a trace. In the years that followed, his case became more than a cautionary tale. It was studied at the Territorial Law Enforcement Academy, shaping federal guidelines on how to prosecute complex murder cases in regions where evidence was scarce and bodies often never recovered. The legacy of the Prairie Wolf was not just the graves he left behind, but the chilling lesson that trust, the very lifeblood of the frontier, could also be its greatest danger. The trial of Henrik Olsen shaped territorial law for decades, particularly in how courts weighed circumstantial evidence and pursued prosecutions when bodies could not be recovered. Yet its greater legacy was the warning it etched into the hearts of frontier families: blind trust could be deadly. The very traits that define survival on the prairie: self-reliance, resourcefulness, and the ability to seize opportunity, could just as easily be twisted into weapons by those without conscience. Olsen's story stands as a dark counterpoint to the myths of frontier heroism. History remembers the guides, scouts, and pioneers who shepherded families toward new beginnings. But the Devil's March reminds us that some with those same skills turned them against the innocent, using trust as a trap and dreams as fuel for their own greed. The 23 victims of Olsen's cruelty. Thomas and Elena Bergstrom and their daughters, Dr. Samuel and Rebecca Hartwell and their children, the Kowalski brothers, chasing prosperity, Patrick and Catherine Brennan, seeking peace for their broken son and elderly. Martha Linkfist, who only wished to die free on her own land, embodied the hope of westward expansion. Their deaths revealed the frontier's most chilling truth. The greatest danger was not always wolves, storms, or hostile raids. Sometimes it wore the face of a trusted guide with pale blue eyes and a reassuring smile, a man who saw faith as weakness and survival as profit. What do you think? Was everything truly revealed in the trial, or might there still be families lost to Olsen's schemes, their remains hidden somewhere in the vast Dakota Badlands? Share your thoughts below. And if this story sent a chill down your spine, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Until next time, remember, the frontier was not only built on courage, but also haunted by betrayal.